Good afternoon. I'm Shelley Tingle with ERDC Live, and I am with the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center Corporate Communications Office. Today, we are continuing our conversation about ERDC's climate change solutions, and my guest today is my friend, Dr. Andy Nelson. Dr. Nelson has newly been named the director of the Construction Engineering Laboratory in Champaign, Illinois. Good afternoon, Dr. Nelson.
Good afternoon, Shelley. Good to see you from up here in Champaign.
The International Atomic Energy Agency recently said the energy sector must adapt to overcome the challenges posed by climate change. What is ERDC doing in energy resilience to support the DoD and its missions around the world?
Yeah, well, thanks first, Shelley, for the opportunity to be here. It's great to have an opportunity to talk about the work that ERDC does in this space. And there's a lot of different things going on. So I will hit on a few of them today as we talk through this, but I'm sure there'll be many questions that come on. So that IAEA report that you're referencing, that comes from a global assemblage of countries that are bringing the knowledge and the thinking into that. And the fact that the international community as a whole is recognizing this need for the energy sector to transform, for the need for low carbon energy supplies, for resilient energy in response to climate change, and to meet the need for the secure and reliable energy in the future is really significant. When we connect that with what's going on in the United States and the current administration and President Biden's interim national security strategy guidance, that talks about this need to enable economic, health, biotech, energy, climate, and national security. We have to focus on all of these things. So in this series that we're talking about here, under the guise of climate change overall, but really, what we're talking about today is energy resilience. And energy resilience is just one component of that whole space, of the space of climate change and what we need to do as a nation and what we do within ERDC, trying to get after that with research and development and with working with our partners in industry, working with our installation partners and our other government partners. So one of the things that we're doing right now actively within ERDC is helping to develop a USACE R&D strategy that focuses on what do we need to do in installations and operational environments, and really what do we need to do in energy resilience to help achieve these goals that have been laid out for us by the administration as a whole. So we're actively right now looking across the whole of our organization to really understand what is the space, what are the requirements, and where do we need to continue doing R&D. Now, specifically, places that we're focused on, we're thinking about things in terms of big rocks right now. So we're thinking about what are the big efforts or the big areas that we know there's going to be change, there's going to be innovation, or there's opportunity to provide more clean, efficient, secure, and reliable energy to the nation. So we're looking at things like the traditional mission of the Corps of Engineers with hydropower. How can we improve predictive maintenance, improve predictive decision-making using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and big data to help get ahead of problems so we can do a more efficient job in terms of maintaining, operating these and avoid situations where we may have outages or may have loss of power. We're looking at developing clean energy. We're supporting a number of different projects looking at gas technologies, using gas technologies on installations, at large scale and grid scale energy storage systems. We're looking at how do we continue to use or modify the way that we use lithium-ion batteries and lead-acid batteries in our operational energy, as well as in operations on installations. We're very aware of the focus from the administration on the incorporating electric vehicles across the fleet for the federal government, the light vehicle fleet. And there are great opportunities on Army installations given the size of the fleets that exist and the fact that the infrastructure there is largely within the domain of the installation. So trying to understand how do we apply electric vehicle charging infrastructure, how does that impact the resilience of our grids on installations is important. And then how do we incorporate renewable energy? So I think we'll talk in a little bit about net zero energy initiatives and some of the work that we've done over the years in planning. And much of this comes down to, we know that there is excellent innovation going on in the private sector, in industry, within the Department of Energy, and other partners who we work with all the time. But the key for us, and really what we try to focus on in this space from ERDC, is understanding how do we apply those things in the context of the Army and in the context of the Department of Defense. And as the administration has sort of put forward and put a challenge forward, how does the buying power of the Department of Defense, how can we leverage that to help advance clean energy initiatives, advance resilient energy initiatives, and focus on that both in the homeland and abroad. So our forces are deployed globally, all over the place, all the time, and energy is critical to the ability of the Army to conduct its missions, whether that's a combat mission or if that's an emergency response mission. We have to have energy, and it has to be available and ready and usable for us. So we work in sort of across this whole, homeland to contingency operations and everywhere in between, trying to really be an integrator, a partner, but also leading R&D in some specific areas and working closely with others where it makes sense.
The recent ERDC white paper cited that the physical threats posed by a changing climate, natural disasters, or intentional physical attack are compounded by interconnected nature of our energy systems. Can you please explain that threat further and what ERDC is doing to mitigate those threats?
Yeah, well, when we talk about that, the physical threat of a changing climate and natural disasters, what this really gets back to is what is the role of Army installations within the Army itself. So as the Army looks forward and we understand multi-domain operations and how we'll operate in a multi-domain environment where cyber becomes a key critical component of all of this, and as we look towards the Army installation strategy that was published in December of last year, talking about a connected constellation of installations, our ability to project power, to fight, to win, and to sustain the operations that the Army is expected to sustain are fundamentally dependent on our installations in the homeland. And the Army has made the assessment that the homeland is no longer a sanctuary. So we understand that we're under attack in numerous different ways through all sorts of different vectors all the time. And so focusing on those challenges and where does that intersect with our ability to project power is really important. So you brought up in the question specifically cyber-physical infrastructure and cyber-physical systems. So this is that intersection between control of our electric grid and our electric systems, or our provision of gas or other sorts of energy, and the intersection of that with digital control systems. Control systems that are connected to the internet or have the ability to connect to the internet. And the fact that we have in some cases centralized control required or decentralized control, but we have threats and we have vulnerabilities that are encountered because of that. We look at, doesn't take a lot to look through sort of recent history and several examples. We saw what happened in Texas earlier this year in terms of impacts on physical infrastructure there, what happened in the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline, and we recognize that Army installations are not islands on their own. We rely on the local grid and the national grid to provide energy and power at installations. It is important and imperative that we partner with local communities, with energy utilities and providers and public-private partnerships to understand this space and really understand where the threats are posed to the Army by this interconnected nature between what we have inside our fence line and what we have outside our fence line. So to that end, there's a couple of things that we've been working on recently. One of them is up here at Searle, is what we call the Control Systems Testing Laboratory. This gets after some of the challenges that we have when we want to look at new control systems or new types of digital infrastructure that we might install in an installation or a building. But it gives us the opportunity to install those in a controlled test environment and have our red team hackers from the Information Technology Laboratory try to understand what are the vulnerabilities that we may be introducing, and then developing criteria and guidance to help avoid those or mitigate those kinds of threats. Additionally, very closely work then with that work at Searle is work at ITL, where the ITL, the Information Technology Laboratory, is developing something called Cyber City, which is a lab environment that's geared towards looking at virtual diagnostic testing against cyber attacks on different kinds of control systems. And the great thing about all this cyber work is, though ITL is in Vicksburg and we're in Champaign, we're able to work very closely together because the kind of experimentation and testing that we do is all in that kind of digital environment rather than having to be at a lab bench. So we're really able to leverage across the capabilities that we have at all the laboratories and sites to do work in that space.
That's incredible, the partnership that we see within ERDC, and that's something very unique ERDC offers, is the ability to form these teams that have a variety of backgrounds to solve the problem. And so a few minutes ago, you mentioned net zero. So ERDC research is seeking ways to improve energy supply, transmission, and demand activities. That includes an effort to achieve net zero energy, water waste at U.S. Army installations. What will achieving that level mean to the U.S. Army?
Yeah, so ultimately, this talk of net zero and the concept overall is really driven back by making our installations more resilient and making our installations more adaptable to changing conditions and changing operations. Net zero energy, waste, and water, it was a big topic of interest about 10 years ago and was a big effort within the Army. We had a number of research programs within ERDC to develop tools to help planners at installations look at installation planning, where to incorporate renewable fuels, where to use different types of energy conservation measures in buildings, and how to do that in a holistic and long-term plan that incorporates with the Army's POM planning process, which is a 5-year cycle, sort of a long-term cycle, which complicates the way that we do things, but is a reality of how the Army operates its business. In the FY21 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress required the Government Accountability Office to review progress made towards those net zero goals by each service, and that's currently underway. So we see that this is coming up again. So this topic, whether we call it specifically net zero, or we're looking at the implications of net zero, which is resilience and adaptability. That's really what we're focused on here, is providing a resilient installation that's adaptable to changing conditions, that's adaptable to an uncertain future, that we know our future is uncertain. When in the context of all of these discussions around climate change, we understand that we have an uncertain future. And while we can model and predict what that may look like, ultimately we need to build ourselves in a way that's resilient and adaptable to whatever those changes may be. So we, within ERDC, have done a lot of work in pioneering approaches to assessing and reaching net zero within installations, both for energy, or for all of energy, waste, and water. I was just talking about that a little bit. And understanding the resources that we use, the uses that are mission critical. So what on an installation has to continue operating versus what can, perhaps be interrupted for a period of time. And then applying innovative technologies to reduce consumption, to detect transmission losses, and using data science to predict inefficiencies in advance, to provide predictive analytics for senior level decision makers and garrison level decision makers to get after some of these problems before they become problems, so to speak. And so the ERDC over the last 10 years has developed a number of different tools to help move toward that net zero future, including what we originally called the Net Zero Planner, is now known as the System Master Planning Tool. We have a water use intensity calculator that we've developed, and these tools are used day in and day out by ERDC engineers in the execution of installation energy and water plans, looking at the future of installations and their energy and water requirements and planning for that.
That is so fascinating, talking about how we are changing how we do things and we're adapting to make the world safer and better. As you know, the DoD is the largest energy consumer within the U.S. government. Can you talk about the development of the virtual testbed for installation mission effectiveness, also known as Vtying, and how this innovative technology can help better manage our key resources?
So I touched on it in the previous answer, and a lot of this comes back to data. We like to say that, you know, we're data rich and information poor, that we have data all over the place, and we have data streams all over the place, and so much of it that at a level, both at a garrison or in a directorate of public works, trying to make decisions on an installation about where to make future investments with limited dollars, but also at a headquarters level in terms of where to make future investments for restoration and modernization or for military construction funding. We have lots of data that is stovepiped, and we have lots of data that is challenging to access and look at in a cross-cutting way. So what Vtying, the virtual testbed for installation mission effectiveness, really gets at is trying to break down those silos. So it's all about data science and data analytics to provide decision makers with predictive and prescriptive analytics that can help when it comes to planning. In one example, planning for things like energy resilience. What are the impacts of different investments on an installation and the future energy resilience of that installation? Now, what's important to understand too is that Vtying doesn't stop there. So we're not just focused on one piece of the problem. This is really focused at the entirety of the installation's domain. And though we I've been very carefully counseled and appropriately so by Mr. Sarash, the acting Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installations and Energy and Environment. How do you eat an elephant? You bite off one piece at a time. So we recognize that we can't do everything at one time, but we have a vision for how this applies across the Army installations domain to help decision makers make more data-informed decisions and break down some of the challenges that we have. And also importantly, we do this all the time within ERDC. We work at the HQDA level, and we work with the primary, the programs and the Army data strategy, the Vantage program that Army has for future data analytics within the Army, to make sure that what we're doing fits in with the plan that the Army has for how we're going forward. We fit in with the Army installation strategy, the Army modernization strategy, the Army data strategy, all of these documents that tell us where we're going. When we're down here at an engineer and research level and science level, we need to make sure that the work that we're doing is fitting in and following in through those kinds of paths. So we work very closely to ensure that we're doing that and try to work very closely across the installations domain. I'll also give, Shelley, a plug to the Corporate Communications Office. I think it's the Corporate Communications Office, and the Power of ERDC podcast. I believe there's a Power of ERDC podcast all about Vtying. So if you want to learn more about Vtying, I think you can go and listen to that podcast, which gives a really great deep dive into the overall program too.
For our viewers out there watching, the website Dr. Nelson is referencing is www.thepoweroferdicpodcast.org. And so feel free to go out and visit us on iTunes or anywhere else to listen to that podcast. In addition to researching alternative fuel technologies such as hybrid, solar, and battery, how important is it that researchers find the next generation power source?
So there's a lot of discussion going on right now about what does the future of power look like for a deployed force. Is that all electric vehicles? How do we centralize and move power and energy throughout a battlefield if it is not in the form of liquid fuel? We're looking at all of these things. We're trying to understand what is this space and working with the Prime Power School and others throughout the Army to really understand what does that look like for the future. Now, we currently support directly with ongoing programs, not this long-term kind of big-scale future, but incorporating hybrid power into our tactical generation systems. So how do we incorporate lithium-ion batteries with traditional generation systems and work that within the domain that already exists, the type of distribution infrastructure, the type of training that is provided for soldiers, and make sure that the solutions that we provide fit into that overall process. Now, because of the breadth of expertise that ERDC has in military engineering, in soil science, we have nuclear engineers here in Champaign, in power and energy. One area where we are consulting right now is on the ongoing project to look at a potential for a mobile nuclear power plant. This would be a transportable fourth generation microreactor that can provide reliable and resilient power. Now, I want to be clear that we're not doing the research to develop this system. That's not what we do. But what we are doing and are helping to support the broader Army community that's looking at this is understanding things like site selection, evaluation, preparation of a site, protection for a system that would be so critical to the operations of on the battlefield. You know, our geotechnical and structures laboratory are really the Army's experts when it comes to blast protection for critical assets on the battlefield. But then also things like what are the environmental impacts, the potential environmental impacts of using such a system. So we're involved in those discussions. Certainly, like I said, not doing the R&D to develop the system itself, but rather the ancillary things that we need to understand to really figure out how would we employ something like this in the field for the Army.
That is so interesting about our new power sources and how ERDC is playing a role in solutions for energy resilience. I'm going to welcome any viewers that have just now joined our ERDC LinkedIn Live event. Today, my guest is Dr. Andy Nelson, and we have been discussing energy resilience and climate change. And so at this time, we're going to go to questions from the audience. Janice has the following question. Is there now or in upcoming budget years sufficient funding to support ERDC's role in the development of climate change solutions and their practical application? If so, what types of projects are we likely to see at ERDC?
So the first question, I think I'll leave the prognostication on whether or not we have the sufficient funding to do the work that's required. There's a lot of discussions going on at high levels in the Army, both and the DoD, of the current year budgets and future year budgets, and what are the implications of directives from the administration on those for climate change and all the other the other things that we're trying to get after at the same time. So specific to where ERDC is working. So when we look at things like the impacts of climate change, so being able to understand those impacts on things like training. So we're talking about what's the future of training ranges and lands as we have new migratory species that may be having changing patterns of migration. How does that affect the Army's ability to train their soldiers? How does that affect our ability to train with new equipment that's being developed through the Army modernization priorities? So you see a lot of things, I think, in that kind of environmental impacts and impacts on the ability of the Army to train. There's also thinking going on about, what's the future impacts of this on migration of peoples and, conflict drivers associated with things like water scarcity, where we support and work with other partners across the government in areas like that as well. Certainly, there is going to be a continued and future focus on things like microgrid and smart grid systems for installations, both at home and abroad, as we recognize those, again, those challenges I was describing earlier on the kind of inside the fence, outside the fence, reality that we live with on our installations. And frankly, with when it comes to energy security, the implications are not, they don't stop at the ability to keep the lights on in the buildings in our installations. It really comes down to where do our soldiers, where do our civilian employees live and work, and many of them live in the surrounding communities around our installations. So, we're very connected with those communities, and we need to continue to grow and build on those sorts of partnerships that we have with local communities to make sure that the Army continues to be able to do its mission, which is to fight and win the nation's wars ultimately.
Absolutely. We now have a question from Caitlin. Caitlin wants to know, what are the unique capabilities at ERDC's Illinois lab, Searle, that help address climate change solutions? How do these capabilities complement other federal research organizations that are working to address climate change?
Yeah, so again, I'll take this question from the energy perspective, since that's kind of the topic of what we're talking about here today. But there's a few very unique facilities here in Champaign at the Construction Engineering Research Lab. One of those is the what we call the ERDC Forward Operating Base Laboratory, the EFOBL. This is a site that I can see out my window from here. It's on the north end of our site. where we have most of the types of structures, semi-permanent structures that you would see built in a contingency operating location, whether that be in a conflict or in an emergency or disaster response situation. In addition to that, we have water distribution systems, we have power distribution systems, and the ability to run on shore power, so to run on the local grid, or to run these systems on things like tactical generators that we have out there. What this gives us the ability to do is essentially have a fully controlled laboratory type setting to test and evaluate new technologies that may help us with things like energy resilience or water security in a deployed force operation. So if you're out there, we can see things like the hybrid power trailer system that I referenced earlier, things like the distributed low energy wastewater treatment system, which is looking at wastewater treatment systems that can harvest energy and actually co-generate energy right next to the processing of wastewater treatment. We also have out there an incredible capability for 3D printing of buildings. So again, when we talk about climate change, that's a very specific, or it tends to render a very specific type of thinking. But the reality is the implications will be substantial, and one of those implications may be displaced people. One of those implications is also just the need to use materials and approaches to construction that have lower levels of embodied carbon in them. Concrete and materials that we use to build buildings and structures and infrastructure with right now are inherently very energy intensive and very highly carbon intensive processes. So we've been working for a number of years on what many people have maybe seen in the news of 3D printing buildings. In this case, we're using concrete, but we have programs to look at new types of materials. Can we use local materials, or can we use materials that don't have the same level of carbon incorporated into them to be able to 3D print structures or 3D print infrastructure with? So out here in Champaign, we have what we call automated construction or additive construction. So we have a facility out here where we have a full-scale building printed out of concrete on the facility on the north end here of the lot in Champaign. That's just a couple. I think I mentioned some earlier. The control system test lab is an important one, and then the other one I'll mention too is the triaxial earthquake and shock simulator. So as you know, we do a lot of work in qualifying equipment for use in areas that are prone to earthquakes. Basically, what this system is an enormous table, shake table as we call it, which can replicate things like earthquakes, but can also replicate all sorts of different vibrations. So when we think about transporting materials or transporting people, or how do we build structures that are safe and secure in an area that is prone to earthquakes or other kinds of shock, that's a capability we have up here that's pretty unique as well.
So our next question is from our viewer named Edith. Edith has the following question: where can we access the water use intensity WUI calculations? We are currently doing that with IEWP, and I would like to see if other tools are out there.
Yeah, so I would say that the best way to do that is probably to follow up with an email either to Shelley. I'm sure there's a contact mechanism through here, and we can get you Edith connected with the right folks here. Some of those things are really dependent on what organization you're coming from. There's information that is publicly available. There's some information that's not publicly available. But yes, we use the water use intensity tool, and the reason that it was developed is to support the implementation of the installation energy and water plans, the IEWPs. So we have teams here that do the IEWPs that actually work on doing those assessments. But then, based on the knowledge that we gain from doing those assessments, we're able to kind of see where are the things that we need to develop new tools or new capabilities to be able to improve or enhance the way that we get after those requirements that we're given for that we have been given for the energy and water planning.
wants more information about the WI calculations, Edith or anyone else, you can send me a message through Messenger on our LinkedIn, or you can contact ERDC Info, ERDCINFO, at usace.army.mil, and we'll be glad to connect you to our experts. I know that ERDC is involved in Tyndall Air Force Base rebuild from Hurricane Michael. What are some of the lessons it is learning from the project related to energy sustainability? Thank you, Jason, for that question.
Yeah, so we're certainly involved in the Tyndall Air Force Base rebuild. Actually, from here at Searle, we have a senior scientific and technology manager, Mr. Lance Morano, who is stationed forward with the program management office down there at Tyndall Air Force Base, really to be a subject matter expert in terms of how do we incorporate these technologies, all the different things that they're looking at in Internet of Things and operational technology, IT/OT space. And what are the lessons learned from that, just like the question asked. I will say, Tyndall Air Force Base is pushing hard in developing a complete digital twin of the installation. So when we talk about energy resilience, one challenge that we frequently have is the lack of knowledge of where our utilities and infrastructure are, what type exists, and then what are the points of vulnerability to particular buildings and particular sort of mission functions on an installation. So when we connect that with research that we're doing here at Searle in developing a mission dependency index to understand what is the mission dependence for particular buildings and functions on an installation, connecting that up with things like the complete digital twin of an installation, that gives us new capability to again get after predictive analysis for potential threats at an installation. So Tyndall Air Force Base has been doing a lot of work in that space, and they're getting some deliveries now of products, and we're starting to see some capabilities coming online. And I think there's going to be a lot more to learn from what happens there as well. I'll also give a shout, and this is certainly climate change related, not in the energy resilience space quite as much, but in the infrastructure resilience space, in a great project that we have in cooperation with Tyndall Air Force Base to install structural health monitoring systems in some of the hangars down at Tyndall Air Force Base. This is actually leveraging investments that have been made in the Civil Works Research and Development Program for structural health monitoring of civil works structures, but we're applying that knowledge and the expertise that we've developed and have here within ERDC now on the infrastructure side and on the buildings side, facilities side for the Air Force to try to help with again, predictive maintenance. So really this is about sensing how is a building or how is a structure operating. So when we look at this in civil works, we're trying to understand, is there something that has changed in how a structure is operating that is a cause for concern, that we might need to get in there and do something about. We can do the same thing on buildings, and so we're working quite closely with Tyndall Air Force Base and have a project ongoing down there to install this, build the models, and demonstrate this capability as part of their overall integrated approach down there at Tyndall.
Our next question is from Chris. He asks, is ERDC doing any work involving autonomous vehicles?
Yes. So we have had a couple of projects actually in autonomous vehicles. These are partnered with, so we don't do, well, I should say in the context of installations and here in the United States, we don't do development of autonomous vehicle systems. But we do work with, we have a couple of partners who we've worked with for demonstrations at Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall and at Fort Carson on how can we integrate autonomous vehicles into the operations of an installation. So this is really not looking at how do you drive your Tesla onto an installation and we let you put it in autonomous mode and have it drive around the installation autonomously. What this is really looking at is how do we help to make the installation a more livable space, a more improve the quality of life at an installation, but through the use of autonomous vehicles. So we can do things like provide automated transport routes between primary locations on an installation that soldiers may be moving in between, or that families may move between, or employees on the installation. So yes, there's work ongoing right now at Fort Carson, and there's been a project at Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall as well, looking at autonomous vehicles on installations.
Wants to know if ERDC is involved in radio frequency photovoltaic antenna module (PRAM) satellite program, and if so, what are your thoughts on its application in austere environments? Is this a step change? Is it a step change to forward capabilities?
So my answer to the question is ERDC involved. Off the top of my head, I'm not aware. However, we're a very large organization. So it's possible that there is involvement, but I'm not aware of it from where I sit off the top of my head. And as far as my opinion on that, I do not know that technology well enough to be able to give an opinion that I'd be comfortable giving here, or giving it if this was just you and me sitting in a room as well, Shelley. It's not something I'm familiar with, unfortunately.
And if we are involved in it, we'll look that up and we will post that response online. From your time representing ERDC abroad at ERDC's International Research Office in London, how is ERDC and its research viewed by the rest of the world?
Hey, well, I'm really glad to hear that somebody read my bio before this too. So for a little bit of context, and Shelley knows this, but one of my recent assignments was as the director of the International Research Office for ERDC, which is based in London. So I spent 3 years working in London representing all of the ERDC laboratories to our partners, allies, as well as to combatant commands and Army component commands abroad. The bottom line is, how is ERDC viewed internationally is that in the areas where folks know what our expertise is, we are very well regarded. However, I will say that we also highly regard a lot of our partners internationally. So while people will come to us, we also see the need and the value in going and working with others. So there are places where we recognize and need to step back and recognize that maybe we don't always have all the answers or don't always have the best answers. And we have a lot of partners, allies, and friends around the world who are working on a lot of the same kind of challenges and problems that we have, especially when it comes to the civil works world, our environmental research, and our energy research. These are all things that are beneficial for us to be working with allies and partners. So yes, people know who we are. I was shocked, actually, at the number of times that I would walk into meetings and have people who would come up and say, "Do you know researcher so-and-so in this laboratory?" And I would say, well, I don't actually know that person because there's over 2,000 people in this organization, but I'm really glad to know that you understand the good work that we do, and let me see how I can help you to connect with that person, or maybe we could work together.
That's incredible. Our next question is from Alvin. Energy resilience is much easier with new construction. How is ERDC helping with retrofitting aging infrastructure?
Yeah, so that's a very astute point, and is exactly why Tyndall Air Force Base is such an attractive place for us in terms of understanding the future of a near complete rebuild or rework. In terms of retrofitting existing infrastructure or looking at existing infrastructure, part of this is fundamentally understanding what's there in the first place. So when we talked about earlier, we talked about WUI, water use intensity. So we've also done a lot of work in energy use intensity, in collecting data from across many different installations to understand different types of buildings, vintages of buildings, to be able to predict what the energy use of those buildings might be, predict what the construction type of that building might be, so that we can at least have a better idea of what may exist when we do not have all this data collected and collated in one single place. So there's a lot of work on that kind of, again, being data rich and maybe not really knowing what we actually have. So how do we get after that? The other thing that we do a lot of work in is building retro commissioning. So this gets into the energy resilient space when we talk about demand reduction. We realize that we have a lot of facilities that maybe haven't had their control systems in the facility either fully commissioned after the building was built, or more likely over the years things have changed. The use and functions of the buildings have changed, but haven't gone back in and really set up those control systems and commission the facility in a way that's commensurate with how it's being operated. So we support installations in providing training for retro commissioning, in providing some of the equipment that they may not have to be able to do these things themselves, and in some cases, new methods or ways of trying to retro commission buildings and overall improve the efficiency of those facilities and buildings.
Okay, question from David. You mentioned opportunities to incorporate electric vehicles. Can you elaborate on this?
Well, so what this really comes down to is what's already going on at a lot of the garrisons, and so Fort Benning has been doing a lot of work in this space. I think Fort Irwin has some charging stations there as well. But really, if we're gonna go and install a significant number of electric vehicle chargers, we need to understand where will those be utilized. We don't want to, we may not want to put charging stations all in the motor pool and then have our government vehicles all charged in the motor pool. Because the way that we tend to operate, or the way that we do operate, is that those vehicles would then be checked out on a daily basis. Vice, if we put those charging stations at the places of work for the individuals who utilize those vehicles, they only have to be checking those vehicles out on a once-a-week basis and can be charging it at their office on a daily basis. That might greatly improve the overall utilization of the infrastructure. So putting the infrastructure in is one thing, but making sure that we're making the best investments possible is another and slightly more tricky piece. So one of the things we try to do a lot, and we've done with water use intensity and energy use intensity, and certainly have been having conversations with installations who have electric vehicle charging stations, is to try to gather data from where this is being done now, so that we can understand within the context of how the Army operates, because we don't necessarily operate the same way as a company would, or a university, or just a community, a city or a municipality. So understanding the unique ways that we operate can help us to provide planning guidance, and through research on on utilization of charging stations, implementation, placement, all those kinds of things. What are the best ways that we can get the best bang for the buck, so to speak, for the U.S. taxpayer in terms of installing electric vehicle infrastructure on installations. It also comes back to some work that we're doing in looking at traffic patterns and automation on installations. And so, as we move towards more electric vehicles and a future of electrification in the vehicle fleet, there will be competition amongst people who work on installations to go charge their vehicles during the day, right? That's a reality of what's going to happen. What we believe will happen. Well, that's also connected to where are charging stations available. So that happens to be connected to how many people are at the gate waiting to get in on post to go to work that day. So when we look at this holistically at an installation level, we can start to provide updates to people before they even leave their homes to say, hey, this is the way that the way that you ought to come into work today. Because there's lower traffic volume here, you're going to be able to find a charging station near your workplace, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of that, but really what it comes back down to is trying to pull in all those lessons learned and data from installations and work through that to understand what is the kind of guidance that we can provide from a research perspective.
And there again, Searle is providing key data for data-driven decisions, which of course in the end saves the taxpayer money. A question that I have is, what is the future for 3D printing? And so I actually helped lead a 3D printing camp for young students this year. So I would love to know, what do you see the future of 3D printing? What does that look like?
Well, so I think I'm going to admit that I'm not the expert to tell you the future of 3D printing. There is an enormous amount of work going on within the Army, the Marine Corps, across all the services, as well as in private sector and industry on what does that future of 3D printing look like. I know it is, we know it's here to stay. We know that, that those kinds of additive processes are here to stay. Things that help us get the most out of the limited resources that we have are here to stay. And 3D printing is one of those because, we can reduce waste, we can more efficiently create parts, pieces, or, entire buildings in terms of what we're doing for 3D printing of, or for additive construction, 3D printing of buildings. I can say that there are people within ERDC who think about that day in and day out, and there is a very good and a strong working group within ERDC that works on 3D printing and what is the future of additive manufacturing, both within engineering and within the rest of the Army. So unfortunately, Shelley, I will defer to them.
Absolutely. So Bob has a question as well. Are you looking at CO2e reduction by infrared asphalt recycling in place instead of cut and patch on your pavements?
So I am not the pavements expert, and I do not know the answer to that question. But we can get back to you on that question. We do talk a lot about one of the best things that we can do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions is to not throw out everything that we've built in the past. And so from the limited knowledge that I have about pavements, and I think what that question is asking, I think that's really what it's getting after, which is you have embodied energy, you have embodied carbon in everything that we build and make. And so we need to be thoughtful about how we approach tearing down or building new before we think about how do we use what we have now in a way that's new, different, more efficient, more effective, because we've put a lot of energy and carbon into all the infrastructure, buildings, and facilities that we already own. We don't have to do all that again, but there may be ways to be more effective in utilizing what we have already.
We have an in-depth question from Jorge. He says, I would like to switch gears into coastal resilience of cities, specifically about the long-term risk reduction measures through adaptation to sea level rise. The ERDC Innovation Summit this year is looking to shift a culture that tends to be risk adverse to one that will take a chance with innovative ideas. However, one of the problems is that construction is inherently a very conservative industry and risk-adverse one. As the director of the center's construction engineering lab, how do you see USACE adopting innovative infrastructure solutions that differ from the ones that are typically used to deal with coastal resilience? What would your message be to the different USACE districts about thinking out of the box and becoming more risk adverse when considering the implication of new technologies in the civil works area?
Wow, there was a lot wrapped up in that question, but a lot of really, really good points and very good questions. So I will say I come from a family of home builders. So I grew up on construction sites as a kid, and my dad is a home builder, and I understand in the home building community and in the construction industry at large is one that is pretty well stuck in a lot of the traditional methods that have been around for quite a long time. We talked a little bit earlier about additive construction, 3D printing of buildings. This is a fundamental shift in what we would be thinking about for how could you build a building, or how could you build components of a building, or how can you build a bridge or other types of anything that you might need to build. I think where we need to really sort of we have to disconnect the value of doing research and development with the fear of change that sometimes exists and the hurdles that have to be overcome to that change. We understand that. We don't think research that we're doing today is not Tuesday, on Wednesday, it is not going to be put into immediate practice. There are things that need to happen. And part of what we need to do is work together. So we need to, it's not just pushing technology to say this is new technology and we need to adopt this. But we need to understand, and ERDC is really trying to get after this in terms of the relationships with the USACE divisions and the districts, and having liaisons for every one of the districts that we're getting ready to try to increase the level of communication that we have, so that we have a better line of communication to understand the problems and communicate what the future solutions are. And then we have to work together to get over the things like, in the construction industry, building codes and unified facilities criteria and these different kinds of things that are institutional inertia that challenge our ability to move forward. But those are things that we have to work together on. Now, coastal resilience, I'm not gonna dive too far into coastal resilience, because that is, the Engineering with Nature program and the work that Dr. Todd Bridges does and everybody within that program. They're pushing the envelope in terms of thinking about new and innovative ways to get after coastal resilience. And you can look at Tyndall Air Force Base as an example of where that team is doing that right now. And hey, I'll give a plug for their podcast too. They got a whole series of their own, so encourage you to go and take a listen to those too.
Absolutely. That's all the questions we have time for right now. If you have any additional questions, you can leave them in the LinkedIn chat or email erdcinfo@usace.army.mil, and we will get back to you as soon as possible with a response. Dr. Nelson, this has been a wonderful afternoon. It's been such a great discussion. Do you have any closing thoughts as we end today's broadcast?
I think the closing thought, and kind of drawing on that the last question that came up, and sort of some of the themes throughout. I was appreciative that someone brought up my time working internationally, both as an ERDC, as Corps of Engineers, as an Army, as the United States of America. I think we have to recognize that we can't do these things alone. We're not going to succeed if we try to do these things alone. So our national security strategy, everything that we do points towards the need to work with partners and allies. And that can mean people internationally, organizations internationally, and it means, locally here as well, working with our local communities, working with the experts and the expertise in industry, and working with, non-traditional partners. Within ERDC, we have an OTA that's specifically focused in this area, another transaction authority that kind of works in this environment and energy and demilitarization space. And those are opportunities that, getting after some of these tough problems, prototyping solutions, looking at what is the future. We're looking at all kinds of innovative and different ways to do that is not just the traditional way that we have done things, because we recognize the need, particularly, again, bringing this back to the topic of climate change. It's real, it is here, and we have to do something. And we have to do something together, because if we fight over it, or we are territorial and not partnering with one another, we all will lose. So it's really important that we work together. And so, Shelley and the Corporate Communications Office and everybody, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to have this kind of direct conversation with folks who, for me, this is, I guess I get first names from Shelley, but I'm not even sure who's on the other end of the questions, but it's good to be able to have this conversation and hear the kinds of questions that are asked, and also, let you know what kind of what we're doing from here right now. So, Shelley, thank you for the time and for the invitation to do this, and to everybody else who's involved in making all this happen, because I know they don't just make you float out there in the middle of that purple space with, that takes some work to make people do that too. So I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. And thank you to our audience who asked all these wonderful questions. Be sure to tune in next month as we discuss climate change again. We're going to continue the conversation with Dr. Russo and talking about environmental sustainability. So tune in next month, and I'll see you then. Thank you so much.